Good afternoon and welcome to another Ethical Corporation webinar on reporting on the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm Ed Long, I'm one of the project directors at Ethical Corp, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. The SDGs have been a hot topic in sustainability since their inception, with businesses, governments and the NGO community widely accepting them as a roadmap for the future. It's been such a hot topic that we've had seen some great sign-ups in terms of numbers for this webinar. You're joining over 1,400 of your colleagues today. Today, you're going to hear from experts on how to report on the SDGs. We're going to be covering identifying what is relevant for SDG reporting, mapping against your operations on a local, national, and regional level, measuring your impacts against the SDGs, and then finally, properly communicating your impacts against the Sustainable Development Goals. Today, joining us, we have Piet, who is the Senior Advisor for Responsible Investment at PGGM, Mario Abreu, Vice President Environment, TetraPak, Michael Dickstein, Group Sustainability Director at Coca-Cola Hellenic Bottling Company, and James Gomme, the Director of Sustainable Development Goals at WBCSD. Just to kick off, as you may have noticed from those names, that is an all-male lineup. Diversity is important to us at Ethical Corp, and we do try and actively make our panels as diverse as possible. On this occasion, we were unable to do so, but I'm sure you can all agree that the four gentlemen speaking on today's topics will provide useful insights into the topic of reporting on the Sustainable Development Goals. Today's one-hour webinar will be in the form of a discussion where the speakers will be sharing best practice and lessons learned of the work they're doing on SDG reporting. And before we begin, I'd just like to emphasize that this is going to be an interactive discussion. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a box where you can post your questions. Please do post any questions you have throughout the discussion, and I'll try as best as I can to get these answered for you. To kick things off, I'd like to run just a couple of polls for the listeners, just to understand where you're currently at in terms of your journey with regards to reporting on the SDGs. Just a simple one to start off with. Is your organization reporting against the Sustainable Development Goals? Yes, no, and thirdly, yes, but only just started. I'll give you a couple of seconds to give your answers to that. Couple more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so that's quite interesting results. So 70% of those who've signed in so far have voted on that, and you've got 28% who have said yes. They are already reporting on the SDGs. 42% no, and then another 29% saying yes, but they've only just started. Michael, I just want to take it to you for just a second. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on the response of that poll. Is that what you'd think would come from that question?
Well, thank you, Ed. I think first of all, it is a fair reflection of what we see. There are a couple of businesses that are advanced in the sense that they have worked with the SDG, that they have applied the SDGs already for quite some while. Others have just started in their journey. I think the most important is not as to whether a company should apply the SDG, but how to make it most operational and most material for the businesses.
Okay, sure. Okay, we're going to move on to the second poll. So the next poll that we're running is your organization measuring your impacts against the Sustainable Development Goals? So if you just like to answer that, so it's a yes and a no. Couple more seconds on that one. Okay, all right, great stuff. So we've got 38% saying yes, they are, and 62% saying no, which is quite similar to the response rates we had roughly around 6 or 7 months ago, and we asked a similar question on whether companies were measuring their impacts against SDGs, with around 2/3 saying they were, and a third saying they were, and 2/3 saying they weren't. Pete, is that a fair assessment of what you're currently seeing within the industry?
Yeah, I think so. If anything, the yes category seems to be on the high side. Impact measurement obviously is a difficult thing to pull off, especially if you interpret impact as the difference you've actually made compared to a point in time or a benchmark or a reference point of sorts. I think this is a fair reflection. It is important, though, we believe, that we actually measure impacts against the SDGs, because just labeling activities with an SDG or another is kind of low barring it, unless you really put an effort in measuring that actual impact. Chances are you're just SDG washing whatever it is.
Okay, no, that's something with measuring impacts and the SDG washing is something we're going to get into during the webinar as well. And lastly, just one last poll, and then we'll get into the webinar. It's what are you struggling with most regards to SDG reporting? Is it identifying what's relevant, identifying the relevant SDG, mapping them against your operations, or measuring your impact, and then finally communicating those impacts to your stakeholders? I'll give you a couple of seconds just to respond to that one. Okay, all right. So the interesting results there as well. So you've got 5% identifying the relevant as the most difficult, 25% mapping, and then 7% on communicating, and then a really high in terms of measuring your impacts as a difficult thing with regards to reporting against the Sustainable Development Goals, which is something we're going to go over during the webinar itself. So that's really interesting to see. So in terms of the question with regards to reporting on the Sustainable Development Goals, at first, question for you, Mario, to start things off with. How have you gone about integrating the SDGs into your reporting process, and what does success look like?
Ed, I think what we have done is first we identified to the point that you have just asked. First we identified and we mapped against the operations, so we could identify from a perspective of materiality what are the key indicators into the out of the 169 indicators you have associated to the SDGs. Which are those that we believe with our operations we can impact the most. I just think that we have to also consider that the expectation on the SDGs is that they are also transformational in regards to the business. So it's not only a matter of looking at the current business and how it impacts the SDGs, is also a matter of looking at the SDGs and think about for the purpose of my business, what are the SDGs that I should map. So I think the exercise has to be on both sides, the side of identifying what already exists, and on the other side you have to think about how can I actually change the nature, change perspectives in the business so that we can work together and align on more of the targets in the SDGs.
Ed, if I may add to this, if anyone can hear me, that is.
I think we lost. I hear you. I think we lost Ed.
Oh, that's not good. That's not good.
Yep, you can hear you. Sorry, Pete. Sorry.
All right.
Sorry,
okay.
I muted myself.
All right. Okay. If I may add to what Mario just said, we don't necessarily use the word materiality, which we kind of reserve to do our risk analysis, which we kind of keep separate from our SDG positive impact efforts. So materiality is something we do to mitigate our investment risks. SDGs, we believe, are best approached from, as Mario explained, from a core business point of view. To us, the game is not to hit as many SDGs as possible. The idea is to be selective and to pick those SDGs that best fit the core business as it is now, or as you want it to be maybe over a couple of years. And selective pick from the SDGs is important, because only then you can make it manageable and perhaps even more meaningful. Otherwise, the whole thing could easily succumb under its own weight and complexity.
On that, there was a question posed to me prior to the webinar itself, is when you're actually doing that materiality assessment that you mentioned, Piet, how do you recommend, so there's the idea of, would you then recommend to do it through an SDG lens, or would you rather just do an ordinary materiality assessment and then apply the SDGs as a cross-check afterwards? Which way do you think is the best way to do it?
Well, the way we did it, and in fact we did it before the SDGs came along, we picked a couple of themes that either, and we're an investor, right? So our game may be slightly different than TetraPak or Coca-Cola, but the way we approached it is that we picked those themes that either follow from our fiduciary responsibility, climate, that we believe fit our identity, health, or that we believe we have something extra to contribute to, food and water. Now, we mapped those 4 themes to the SDGs, but we approached them from a core business point of view, even though we're an investor, that we believe fit the sort of investor that we are or want to be. Now, of course, then once you pick those themes, all the investments are being evaluated, not just on the opportunity side, the impact you can make on those themes, but also on the risk side. And everything else outside those 4 themes, we consider a potential risk factor. And that's where we apply our materiality analysis. What is indeed a material risk for that particular climate investment or that particular food investment?
Sure. Okay, James. As well, I get to go back to the first question of how do you integrate the SDGs into your reporting process? How do you successfully do that? How are you helping companies at the moment do just that?
Sure. Well, so just for anyone who is not familiar with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, we're a business membership organization of around 200 companies, and we're working with a lot of those companies, those multinationals, to try and support them in integrating the SDGs into their core business and picking up trends in terms of what we're seeing there. Just to echo what Piet was saying and some of the points made so far, I think that first step of prioritization of the SDGs that are most relevant for you is really critical. And going back to the result of the poll, where that was highlighted as being the thing that people perhaps felt was the least challenge, identifying the relevant SDGs, I'd maybe challenge that a bit. I think that's probably the thing that you can most easily do, but to do it properly is probably one of the most difficult, to really understand where you have that capacity. And I think what we're seeing in terms of best practice, and there's some guidance being released by the UN Global Compact and GRI next week at the high-level political forum on sustainable development in New York next week. Some guidance on how to start reporting around the SDGs and how particularly to tackle that prioritization exercise. And I think the key thing there, as Piet was alluding to, is the integration of both negative and positive impact considerations. So it's easy, I think, to fall into the cherry-picking trap and go for the SDGs, which are clearly linked to how you can create positive impact. If you're a healthcare company, SDG 3, we're clearly having a strong impact on health. But I think to dig a bit deeper in the target level as well, to really analyze the framework that the SDGs presents and think, all right, where do we stand to impact this positively? Where do we stand to impact it negatively? Where are the risks to people and planet biggest? Where are the potential benefits we can bring through our products and services? And then to prioritize on that basis throughout the value chain, and really to get a strong understanding of where your contributions could lie, whether that's through minimizing negative impacts or maximizing positive impacts. And then using that as the launch pad into how you're thinking about this. But I think a robust prioritization exercise really is the key to what we're seeing in terms of good SDG strategy and good SDG reporting.
Thanks, James. And there's actually been a couple of questions come through with regards to this in terms of approaches with prioritization. So the question actually come through from the software from Valerie, who's asked why do you want to be selective? Is that not running the risk of choosing only the ones which you could potentially have a positive impact on, and maybe disregarding the ones which you have a negative impact on? And I think on the same point that some companies have actually tried to encompass a lot of the SDGs, and some have focused on a few or even just one or two. Is there a preferred approach here, or is it just what's best for the company at large? Michael, have you got any points?
Certainly. I think that the answer to that question is very much linked to how you look at the SDG. Now, the way that we look at it at Coca-Cola Hellenic Bottling is actually to look at the starting point. I mean, they were introduced by the United Nations. There were various UN organizations contributing to the SDG. There was also, for the first time, a broad consultation process from the private sector to that. As a result of that, the SDG are actually addressing different target audiences. They're addressing, to a large extent, government organizations, civil societies, as well as the private sector and businesses. Now, I'm not quite sure whether this is a difference in denomination to what Piet has said earlier. Yes, we do a risk assessment, and we do also a materiality assessment. And for us, the materiality assessment is a little bit broader. It is actually this classic materiality matrix where we liaise with stakeholders on the one hand to understand what they would expect from us, and on the other hand, simply looking at what is feasible, and what makes most sense in this respect. Now, if you apply that lens, then obviously the only way to really look at the SDG and make them meaningful is to do a selection. I mean, we have at Hellenic, we have a rather broad selection. We have, I would say, even more than half of the SDG that are relevant for us and for our type of business. But certainly there are a couple of SDG where it would be it would be a bit far-fetched to assume that there is a real relevance, or that we could really have a contribution to improving the specific topic of each and every SDG.
Ed, Mario here, if I can just add to Michael. I fully agree, and we have done the materiality assessment following GRI, also from a perspective of understanding our stakeholders, internal and external stakeholders. And what is important about materiality is that it both represents where you can make positive or negative impact. So you understand where your material impacts are. And from that angle, I agree that we have to be selective, but in order to avoid the SDG washing, when we are selective, the reference to materiality here is that any SDG that you can impact positively or negatively in a material way should be part of your assessment, because there's no point in saying that you are measuring your fulfillment of one SDG because you know that is one area where your business is progressing, and ignoring that on another front you might be negatively affecting another one. So it is important to focus and to be selective on what really matters, but it has to be done in a way that you understand which SDGs your business is impacting.
I think this is an important point. If I may just add one more thing, the way we go about is, of course, our materiality assessment, our risk assessment, that is not limited to any of the SDGs. It's across all possible material risk factors, and we don't even apply the SDG framework to that. But we make a very sharp distinction between the risk side and the opportunity side. And for the opportunity side, the do good side, we actually use the SDG framework. And there we believe there's nothing wrong with cherry picking. There's in a way, you know, that's exactly what we need. You need to pick those SDGs where you can have an impact on. And that's how we go about it. Now, in order to avoid that allegation of us sweeping bad news or risk under the carpet, what we do for every SDG investment, whether it's climate, water, food, or health in our case, we have one sheet of paper where we have the impact case, where we have the ESG risk or negative impact also outlined. And then the third paragraph is all things considered, we believe it's worth making that particular investment because the impact, the positive, outweighs the negative. So we don't want to avoid bad news, but we cannot quite make a quantitative or a formulaic approach where we net out the positives and the negatives. So we can't do it in a quantitative way, we do it in a qualitative way. But we are transparent about it.
Thanks for that, Piet. We're getting a host of questions coming in, which is fantastic to see. This is some really great engagement on this. And there's an interesting question come in with regards to, well, two. One's focusing just on materiality analysis in terms of approaches with regards to reporting frameworks. So is this going to be something that's more applicable to the GRI framework, or is it better to look towards the International Integrated Reporting Council, the IRC? And then a second question, which kind of takes it a little bit back to the beginning of the SDGs and materiality. So to what extent do the companies focus a little bit further down than just the goals themselves, and start looking at targets and indicators when they're reporting, compared to just focusing just solely on the goal itself? Are you looking at the goal and then you're diving deeper into each individual target and what your impact could be on those? Or is it looking at it on a holistic view? This is my business operation. Take yourself, Michael. You imagine the SDG with regards to water is quite an impactful one for you yourself at Coca-Cola, and then diving down into those targets. Michael?
Sure. I mean, maybe to start off with one comment that seems quite important to me. The SDG are not a panacea, and they are not like a global constitution for how you should run your sustainability agenda and how you should set up your sustainability strategy. I firmly believe that the added value of the SDG is that we now have, you might call it a common language or a common denominator, so that we're able to put our efforts and our individual targets and commitments into certain buckets. But I wouldn't be in favor of a reversed approach to say, well, what is the SDG goal and how can we apply it for the business? Because that would imply that you haven't made your homework properly. And the homework, in my point of view, is reach out to your stakeholders, talk to them, understand what the issues are. No SDG analysis can replace that. Now, having said that, whether you approach it through the SDG or through your materiality analysis, obviously there are certain topics, issues, challenges, opportunities. Let's not forget about the opportunities. To pick up the example of water that you've said, well, yes, we are a business that depends quite heavily on water and on the sustainability of the watershed and of the water availability for the communities in which we operate. So obviously, first of all, you identify then what is material, what is relevant, and then you drive down. And I've seen personally a certain journey in that over the last 5 years, where we all were quite satisfied with input KPIs, where we then moved onwards to output KPI, and now eventually we are at a level where across the bench, whether that's water, whether that's energy, whether that's a reduction of sugar in our case, or youth-related programs, we really focus on the impact that we are making. which is admittedly much more difficult to measure. Let's not forget that. In practice, it's much easier to identify an input or an output KPI, like how many participants did we have in our Youth Empowered program in 2017. But then to actually measure whether we have really improved the lives of those participants, whether they were more competitive in finding jobs on the labor market, that's a different story, but the right focus that we should all apply.
Excellent, thank you, Michael. I'm quite conscious of the time, and I would like to move the debate on slightly onto the second point with regards to mapping. Mapping the SDGs against your operations on a local, national, and a regional level. So I had an interesting question come in prior to the webinar itself with regards to a comparative. So if companies are working in different regions, in different areas, how can they compare and add up livelihoods in the developed world with livelihoods and living wages in developed countries? How can you map that essentially? And I'd like to throw that to you, Mario.
Yeah, and in our case, we normally try to have global standards for questions like that. When you mention livelihoods, for instance, we do a lot of work, of course, with forestry in sourcing, and there the rules are, and the certification standards are more or less equal. Doesn't matter where you operate. We also try to set the same standards for our own operations and suppliers. So we use global policies and processes as much as possible, and bringing that into the SDGs, of course. And to the point I was making before, when a company is assessing their impact on a specific SDG, is very important, definitely, to understand, corroborating what Piet said as well, is also to understand where your negative impacts could go. Because I think from the position of investment and the position of business, there might be a difference in regards to how do you assess the potential of your operations in a specific region or a specific part of the world to promote good or to promote kind of a bad practice. So the SDGs not always, in terms of the different targets, not always help in regards to language to promote the best possible assessment. But as it has been said before, the SDGs provide kind of the framework that compels for a better business narrative, and securing that practice are convenient and they are fair across different regions and nations is absolutely important.
James, do you have any points on that part?
Yeah, just to maybe add to both those previous questions, actually. First of all, the question on SDG targets, and I would say that really is the essential part of understanding this agenda, is the granularity set out in those targets. And if you're not engaging with the SDGs at the target level, I think there is room for misconception, or for perhaps going down a rabbit hole that is endless in terms of what you should be focusing on. So, I mean, just to give an example again around SDG 3 on health, SDG 3.6 looking at reducing road traffic accidents. So you may think that SDG 3 not particularly related to your business, but if you look at road traffic accidents and you're a mining company, for example, then that's something that then is a clear linkage to. You may not have understood that linkage without going into the granularity of the target. And likewise, I think understanding the geographic differences in terms of SDG priorities is also a very important part. So I guess if we're looking at the SDGs as both an input to strategy and an output for your reporting, on the reporting side, even if not disclosed in your actual report, being able to disaggregate the data of your impacts on a geographical basis, I think is a really beneficial trait to be able to point to. If we're looking at the business benefits of engaging with the SDGs, an enhanced license to operate or an enhanced reputation at a local level is a key benefit. So if you can point to a particular region and say, look, we've had this impact on this SDG here, here, and here, then that's going to win you acceptance and license to operate in that particular geography. Likewise, if you're moving to look at your SDG priorities and 70% of your operations are in Southeast Asia or in a particular geography in Southeast Asia, being able to show an understanding of the SDGs that are priority focus areas for governments in that region is, I think, going to be able to help you to set a strategy that really helps you engage and to generate the maximum impact. And there's now a large series of tools coming out that helps with this sort of thing, the SDG index and dashboards that are available showing SDG priorities or SDG performance of various countries globally. The World Bank SDG Atlas is another example, and this new tool called SDG Tracker. All of these new pieces of work coming out and these pieces of research that I think provide business with some sort of way of cutting through this complexity. And it is a very complex agenda, but the tools now are starting to come out to help us really understand the local implications of the SDGs and help us to integrate that into strategic thinking.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to move on if anyone else, unless anyone else has any further points. I'm getting a lot of questions come through with regards to measurement and how to measure impact. And one came through as a beginning. I think it's quite a good start from just defining firstly what impact means to the panelists. So impact's quite multifaceted and it's quite a debated term as well. So how do you actually define impact within your company? I think if we just have a quick discussion in regards to that, and then we can get into how you're measuring that impact as well. So, Piet, how do you define impact?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Ed, because we actually try to avoid the word impact investor because being a fiduciary, we manage pension fund assets. We are severely constrained in going after unserved communities or unserved issues. To us, impact, and the way we've defined it, and we've launched a definition at the PRI in-person meeting in 2016. The key components of the definition of what impact means to us is that it's something that is seen as a solution to either one of those global challenges. So we've actually mapped sets of solutions to every one of the SDGs, and we can invest in those solutions with the expectation of a market rate return, and the impact through that company or through that project in which we invest needs to be measured. So it's these three things, right? It's got to be a solution the way we've identified it. It's got to be, at least it's got to have the expectation of a market rate return because that's our fiduciary obligation, and it's got to be measured. That's what impact is to us. But it's, again, it's a very particular take on it. There's other investors and certainly companies that would define it differently.
And on that, Michael, how do you define the word impact within Coca-Cola Hellenic?
I think there are a lot of similarities to what Piet has just said. It needs to provide a solution. It needs to provide a sustainable solution. I think one call out in this respect for us is that we have measurable, i.e. tangible KPIs, which in some areas is quite difficult in itself because how to move from qualitative KPIs to really quantitative KPIs in order to measure it in a way that it is that everybody sits on the same line, that it is not arguable, that you have the expression that I used before, a common denominator, so that everybody is able to understand whether the long-term sustainable solution has been really achieved. So the more tangible, the better it is.
Okay, thank you. And Mario, pose the same question to yourself. And if you're wondering, James, I'm coming to you next.
Well, thanks, Ed. Yeah, so the way we have been looking at impact, we actually have been in a collaborative initiative called VIA, Value and Impact Assessment, for a couple of years to understand our impact in regards to one specific part of the business. And the way we measure that was we try to understand what would be the current status of a specific area. if actions that we have taken would not have existed. So to be able to compare what is the status quo with what would be the scenarios if the actions we have taken would not have happened. And the impact can be positive or negative. So it's very hard sometimes to understand, because it's very difficult to go back and or to start from a specific baseline and start measuring forward. But for us, definitely is kind of understanding what are the consequences of activities that you have conducted, and understanding whether these consequences are positive or negative. What type of development those consequences have taken.
And finally, James.
Sure, yeah. I'm in the lucky position, unlike the other guys, of not actually having to measure the impact of my organization, but we advise people, so I can tell people what to do. I think on the impact measurement side, it is about finding the right metrics or the right things to actually measure as a starting point. And I think there is some good guidance out there. The SDG Compass, which came out in 2015, highlighting a number of indicators that companies could track in terms of looking at impact on each SDG. And similarly now, another piece of work as an extension from that, something called the Analysis of Goals and Targets by the UN Global Compact and GRI. It gives you an extensive list, and for each SDG target, it highlights a number of potential disclosure items that companies can disclose around and track to look at impact. Again, looking at the actual scale of your impact is another method, or another question rather, and that I think has to be done internally, sort of figuring out what is your best way of tracking that impact and measuring that impact. And there's various sort of social and environmental impact assessment techniques that are available there. But I would say there are a growing number of resources to help with this, and also increasingly a number of tools that are being made available by other organizations like TrueCost, etc., as well, to help you measure that impact and provide support in this area.
Great stuff. Thank you for that. A really interesting question.
And if I can add just one thing to that, I've seen a lot of guides and toolbooks and stuff that are certainly suited to support businesses and companies. I think eventually what is still the best measurement for each and every business is, regardless of what guideline you're using, how to make a KPI actionable, relevant and quantifiable. I think those are the three dimensions, and this is not something that we have invested in the sustainability world. Impact KPIs are a term that we use across our business, not only related to CSR topics. So I think a healthy conversation with our colleagues from finance or commerce would probably also help us as a guidance, and also to internalize how to use the company language, then also for your own impact measurement.
Okay, and that brings me to a question, actually, Michael. Posed, obviously, the Sustainable Development Goals have been set as they're not just a sustainability function. The intent is to implement them into a wider business strategy. So the question being, and you've sort of touched on it there, Michael, is how do you measure, evaluate, and then integrate your contribution to the SDGs within wider corporate KPIs? How does this interplay within the business itself?
Well, you know, one of my personal standing lines that I'm always using in contact with stakeholders or my own team is that if a sustainability strategy is not closely linked to the business strategy, it will not be sustainable in itself. So I think one way or the other, regardless of the industry sector and the type of business that you're in, you need to make sure that you link the materiality, the expectations from your stakeholders very closely to what makes sense also from a business perspective. There are certain CSR drivers that I see, and we have long left the area of using SDG or the sustainability strategy in itself only for philanthropic reasons. I think nowadays it's much more about risk mitigation, about eco-efficiency, about license to operate, and eventually also business opportunities. How can we use our sustainability agenda in order to generate additional business directly or indirectly? I think this is a key question, and if you approach it by that way, then your question, Ed, is kind of implicitly woven into, and you will get the answer automatically.
Okay, thank you. One last question on the measurement side of things, and I think we'll move on to the communication side. Social. So in terms of a lot of the SDGs are socially leaning towards it with regards to human rights. How do you measure, and this is an age-old question, I think, which it might be tough, but how do you measure your impacts on a social perspective? It's a little bit easier on an environmental perspective, but how do you put a value on those, the social side of the SDG work that you're currently doing within your business? Mario?
Well, that's a very important side of our business as well, because of course TetraPak might be better recognized for packaging, but we are also a food processing company. So we make equipment for food production, and there we can really put a number of the activities we have towards, for instance, zero hunger, and we have done that also because the way we look at the SDGs is not only as a matter of reporting our performance to a global blueprint, is also because and I think it's not only for us, but the SDGs, they have to help educating business leadership so that the SDGs can be integrated into the business, because we want to have a better, more sustainable future for 2030. So I think the SDGs can help build commitment and ambition for business, create space for innovation, create space for leadership. And we see that very clearly when we look into our role, for instance, to make food available for society with the types of process and equipments that we can offer our customers.
Thank you for that, Mario. James, do you have any thoughts on that side of things?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to your comment on human rights there, and I think that's a really important ingredient of the SDGs, which sometimes perhaps gets overlooked. I mean, in the 17 SDGs themselves, human rights and respect for human rights sits across all of them very clearly. I think the Danish Institute for Human Rights did some mapping and found like 90% of the targets linked to a clear existing human rights standard. But there's no standalone human rights SDG per se. So sometimes the temptation, I think, is that these two agendas are separate. But I think that the great thing about the Sustainable Development Goals, it gives the opportunity to maybe reframe some of these human rights efforts that companies are making in a more positive tone of language. So often when we talk about human rights, it's always framed around business risk or risk to operations and the risk of having human rights violations, etc. Whereas I think the SDGs gives us that opportunity to reframe this as an opportunity agenda. So if we look at by respecting human rights, or in implementing our corporate respect for human rights through robust human rights due diligence, through living wage programs, through gender equality programs, we can make clear impacts on the SDGs, and by fulfilling these sort of human rights requirements, we can have robust and very strong SDG impacts, which is then an opportunity to communicate around these and bring these to the fore more strongly as well. So I think very important to bring that human rights element into discussion here. And there's an interesting paper coming out next week, again, around these UN discussions around SDGs and human rights, and some case studies from companies there. So it's something to look out for there as well. Okay, excellent. And when we're conscious of time, so I'll move on to the communication side of this webinar. So
externally, and there's been the term has been thrown around of SDG washing, which is describing the way the businesses are using the Sustainable Development Goals as a communications tool rather than actually what their initial aim, the aim of the SDGs is. So they're continuing on with the normal day-to-day operations, but I'd say communicating through that lens. How do you, firstly, do you think this is the case, and how do you avoid this, if it is, Michael?
Well, I think the basic question, Ed, is what do you consider your day-to-day operations? And at what stage are you with your business? So just imagine that you're a business that is pretty advanced in your sustainability agenda, that has a strategy, that has the engagement with stakeholders and a broad alignment around the strategy, where you have commitments that are tangible, that are measurable. Then I think you are in your day-to-day operations in a pretty good spot. And in that respect, or in that situation, I would say, you know what, fantastic. Yes, please keep doing that, because there will be a very obvious link then between your sustainability strategy and the SDGs that are relevant for that. A different situation, obviously, is if you are not that far advanced as a business. If you're still identifying your sustainability strategy, then, as I said during the introduction, the SDG might be a very good framework that will help you and guide you as to where potential issues could be. And then you should do the same exercise and the homework, i.e. identify what your commitments are, what is your strategy, what are your targets, and how do you make them measurable. If you're jumping ahead of all those steps and you're communicating something that hasn't got this fundament, then obviously you're moving into an area where it will probably become difficult to defend.
Piet, any thoughts on this point?
The first I have to unmute myself, but yeah, I certainly do have thoughts on this. The communication part is pretty crucial to us, and why is that? That is because we have been created to pay out pensions, and to the extent that people want their pension with a purpose, it's all about communication. We need to communicate that their pension savings have been put to good use in terms that beneficiaries, participants can actually understand. So communications is not just an afterthought, it's probably the reason that we even do this. Now, we have to treat carefully there in communication, communicating impact. First of all, we account for impact, but we cannot yet manage for impact. A subtle distinction, but a very important one, because we make investments on financial grounds, and then we start accounting for the impact that those investments have generated. If we were to chase maximum impact, we probably would have to focus on Southern Sudan or Somalia or so, and obviously we can't do that. That's not where the returns are. So we have been constrained in managing impact. Hence, I always try to be very clear, we account for impact, but we cannot yet manage for maximum impact. That's the one thing. The other thing is that we do this across different asset classes, including listed equities, for example. That always raises questions like, okay, so you're investing in a listed company that does whatever it does, with or without you, it doesn't really matter. For you, there's always another shareholder to be found. So what is the actual impact that you have as a provider of capital to those companies? And in all honesty, that impact is very limited indeed in those markets. And yet we think it's worth doing, because those companies in which we invest, they create real impact, and we are at least associated with that impact. Also, we work with those companies in trying to capture and quantify that impact through engagement. So we feel it may not be our impact, but at least we help companies quantify it. The other thing is that in some markets, private markets mostly, you could argue that certain investments, certain companies, certain projects would not have been financed without us. That is a very heroic assumption these days, with tons of free capital sloshing around, but still that is in theory a defensible proposition. That's where we believe we can have real impact that would not have happened without us. So we make the distinction between impact alignment in public markets and real impact in private markets. And then we try to account for it as well as we can without claiming that we pursue maximum impact, because that's something we simply just can't or cannot yet do.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that, Piet. Mario, have you got any thoughts on in terms of the communication side of the SDGs and how to avoid SDG wash, as it were?
Exactly. Well, I think it is very important to really be transparent there, because we know that all the SDGs, they are interconnected. So it cannot be a matter of reporting a positive thing around one or two SDGs and ignore a negative impact on another SDG. Let me give a very simple example. Let's say you are a business producing solar panels, and you can boast about it, and you can say we're supporting innovation, we're supporting climate action, so I tackle SDGs 9 and 13. But then if you don't take care of your operations and you need materials that are creating impact on land or waste that create impact on water, then you have a negative impact on 14 and 15. So I think this is one very serious issue, because we can't avoid the SDGs to become a potential greenwashing. We have to see them as interconnected, and we have to see all the 17 SDGs as something that we have to accomplish all together. So to avoid the risks of SDG washing, I think we have to always be very clear about which SDGs I am impacting and how I am, what type of impact that is.
Thank you, Mario. I'm going to move on to just one last question, and then we'll summarize the webinar. What top tips you have for reporting against the SDGs and implementing them into your reporting processes? Just a general question: what challenges has the SDGs posed, not just for your business but for your reporting processes, and how did you overcome them? Michael?
Well, thank you, Ed. In the line of thinking of what I said before, there were no particular challenges arising from the SDG. It was a very useful exercise to match our sustainability strategy that we've already had with the framework that the SDG provided. So that's my first comment. The second comment, I think. A little bit back to what Mario said before, in communicating the SDG, maybe a challenge or the most difficult thing is to remain fully transparent and honest and authentic. And you know what? If in a certain commitment area you haven't achieved what you want to achieve, then you know what? Be honest about it and don't start beating around the bush. This will increase the credibility from stakeholders, and this will help you to communicate then the broader agenda. I think this is, I wouldn't call it a challenge, more a pitfall that you can avoid easily, but you need to be mindful about that.
James, I'm sure, taking from your role within WBCSD, that you've probably seen you've worked with a lot of companies on regards to this. What are the big things that you've seen as challenges for businesses with regards to the SDGs and reporting?
Yeah, I think that issue of we've talked about a couple of the pitfalls, right? And I think for me that the damning turn of SDG wash is always a little bit harsh, because there's lots to be done around trying to look at your existing strategies, which are doing great things, and then communicating those in terms of the SDGs. I think that's a very important thing to be doing, is looking at what you're already doing and explaining that in the language of this new framework, which is the universal language of sustainable development. But I think there's also pitfalls to watch out for in terms of cherry picking the easy SDGs and just having a positive conversation around the SDGs. So those are the two main pitfalls I would point out, really, just not cherry picking and overly focusing on positive things. In terms of what WBCSD member companies are doing, we're sort of seeing around 80% of our 200 or so members communicating around the SDGs in some way, around 46% describing how they're contributing to specific SDGs, so having prioritized certain SDGs, talking about them, but then only around 22% describing their performance mapped against particular SDG targets. So I think that probably is the big challenge area at the moment, where companies are going down this route of saying, what are the priority SDGs for my organization? What are we doing to contribute to those SDGs? But at the moment, it's only a relative minority of companies that are actually able to say, how are we contributing to specific SDG targets? So I think that is the North Star, if you like, that we're trying to push forward, is having that conversation and that awareness at the target level to provide that granularity. Yeah, so that's one of the main issues that a lot of our companies are facing so far. And I think just generally, really, this idea of forward-looking as well. I think it's great to sort of explain what we've already done and what we're already doing on the SDGs, and there's ways to do that. But this idea of using the SDGs to inform future-looking strategy, setting longer-term targets for those companies that are able to do so. And the thing with the SDGs to remember as well, having come out in 2015, there is that gap that a lot of companies had set 2020 strategies. So the SDGs for a lot of companies didn't come at a particularly good time, so they came halfway through a strategy setting period. But taking the opportunity of the SDGs to set longer term SDG targets is also an area I think that could be built upon moving forward.
Okay, thank you very much for that, James. I'm now going to wrap things up because we're coming towards the hour. So if I could just get just a summarization of your top 3 tips, guys, with regards to SDG reporting. I'm going to start with you, Piet.
Yeah, top 3 tips. One is be selective. Pick those that really match your core business. Second, pick just a handful of KPIs. Try to focus on what is relevant and practicable, rather than trying to be comprehensive. And 3, perhaps, with that focus on selected SDGs, make sure you don't forget about, the possible negative impacts or the risks that you run on other SDGs. Find a way to at least deal with that, to avoid the allegation of cherry picking and SDG wash.
Okay, Michael, your top 3?
First one, similar to what Piet had said, I would, in the extension of being selective, I'd also say be distinctive. Be distinctive. Look at the sort of organization that you're working for, the type of business, the character, the DNA, in order to express that also through the way that you select SDG. Second, very closely related to that, be authentic. Be authentic in your comms approach, what you have achieved, what you still need to achieve. Third, be inclusive. As I said all along through this webinar, in my point of view, you can only look at the SDG in close combination to your stakeholder materiality metrics. Being inclusive means that whilst you walk along the way, you stay in close contact with your stakeholders in order to understand whether the things that you're doing are the things that they appreciate.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And Mario?
3 tips. So I think first, don't just do that from the sustainability department in your company. It requires that the analysis of the SDGs is done considering the full scope of business. The second is align as most as possible with your business narrative. Secure that the language you're using for your business narrative or purpose is the same type of language used in the way you communicate the SDGs. And third, secure that you understand your footprint so you can see the positives and the negatives and be transparent about how you are addressing them.
Thank you, Mario. And last but not least, James, your top 3 tips for our listeners? James, are you there?
Sorry, I was talking on the mute. Yeah, so I would say my top three very quickly. First of all, make the most of all the universe of tools that are starting to be out there. I know there is a lot out there, and it's a very fast-moving space in terms of new resources, but there are a lot of resources out there that can help. We've collected some of them together at WBCSD at our SDG Hub, sdghub.com, which a lot of those resources can help. Next, I would say talk to people, keep the discussion going. What we found very valuable with some sector groups that we have represented within WBCSD is to get different sectors together to talk about common challenges and have discussions at that sector level around what's the key ways that a sector itself can impact the SDGs. So talk to other people in your industry and get a handle on what they're thinking as well. That sort of collaborative effort can really be useful. And finally, I would say make the business case internally. There is a very strong business case. There's lots of material out there. The Better Business, Better World report by the Business and Sustainable Development Commission makes a very clear and compelling economic case, which can really help to push this argument up and get more departments other than just the Sustainability Department engaged and look for more opportunities on the business side as well.
Thank you, James. We'll wrap the webinar up there. Thanks to James, Mario, Michael, and Piet for their insights today. It's been a great discussion, but unfortunately, time has run out. So you will receive the recordings to this webinar within the next week or so. I'll try and get those across to you as soon as possible. And if any of those questions, if you look towards your screen now, we're running a reporting conference later on in the year where you'll see some of the speakers today at the event itself. It's on the 10th and 11th of October in London. So if you're interested in attending, please do let us know. And it'll, some great insights today. And thank you very much for listening. See you next time.